Everyone believes Marcus Vale killed his ex-wife. He never corrects them. When Serena Vale dies in a violent fall inside her Boston townhouse, suspicion settles easily on Marcus, her powerful, emotionally distant husband who inherits everything she leaves behind. Though never charged, Marcus allows the story to stand. Silence is safer than truth. Then he marries Elena Hart. The marriage is transactional, private, and tightly controlled. Elena is not law enforcement. She isn't investigating him. But as a legal compliance advisor, she understands systems, and she knows when something doesn't add up. Inside Marcus's world, Elena encounters escalating security, missing records, anonymous threats, and a past that refuses to stay buried. As public pressure builds and Marcus becomes the focus of renewed scrutiny, Elena begins to uncover signs that Serena's death was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act, hidden behind financial authorization and suppressed audits. The deeper Elena looks, the more dangerous the marriage becomes. If you enjoy emotionally rich stories like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Now, back to where we left off. The townhouse lights had been dimmed too low for a room this large, as though restraint itself might soften what had already sharpened beyond repair. Shadows pooled in the corners and clung there, heavy with the scent of old wood, polished leather, and Serena Vale's perfume, expensive, deliberate, and lingering longer than it should have. Serena stood barefoot at the dresser, her back straight, her shoulders set as if bracing against an impact that had already been decided. Her hair had slipped loose from its pins, dark strands falling down her spine in uneven lines. A crystal tumbler rested near her hand. Beside it, a prescription bottle lay on its side, the cap discarded, white tablets scattered across the surface like punctuation marks no one intended to read aloud. Marcus Vale remained near the door. He had not removed his coat. He had not moved since he entered. He looked like a man who belonged in controlled spaces, courtrooms, boardrooms, places where panic was considered an inefficiency and silence could be shaped into something useful. "Well," Serena said. The words snapped through the room, brittle and sharp. "Are you going to pretend this isn't happening, or are you going to say something?" Marcus did not answer. Serena's gaze flicked toward the hallway, toward the low murmur of a television left on for a child who should have been asleep. A cartoon voice rose, absurdly cheerful, then dipped beneath the sound of movement, a small body shifting, half awake. "Wyla." Serena's mouth tightened. "You brought her here." Marcus's eyes never left Serena. "You asked." She laughed once, the sound stripped of humor. "You always talk like that. Like this is a negotiation instead of a disaster." Marcus took a step forward. Serena's hand came up instantly, palm facing him. "Don't." He stopped. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The only movement came from the slow slide of shadow along the wall as a passing car's headlights swept across the windows. Serena reached for the tumbler, drank, and set it down too hard. Ice cracked against glass. "You think you can wait me out," she said. "Let time do the work for you. People always believe what's easiest." Marcus's jaw tightened, though only slightly. "This is over." Serena turned, her eyes bright now, with a focus that felt dangerous. "Over?" She reached for the prescription bottle, tipped it so the pills rattled against the glass surface, then shoved it back. "You want me quiet. You want me compliant. You want everything clean." Marcus moved again. "Don't," Serena warned. He did not reach for her face. He did not reach for her throat. His hand lifted, slowly, deliberately, claiming the space between them before she could retreat. Serena flinched, then hardened. In a sharp, furious motion, she swept her arm across the dresser. The velvet tray flew first. Rings scattered across the floor, metal skittering like dropped ammunition. Earrings struck the wall. A thin gold watch slid, clipped the edge of the dresser, and fell. It hit the hardwood with a precise sound, rhythmic and unmistakable. The sound settled into the room, ticking steadily, insistently. Serena's breath caught. "You touch me?" she said, "and I swear I will make sure you never see her again." Down the hall, The television laughed, bright, oblivious, slicing through the tension with careless cheer. Marcus closed the distance. 2 steps. Efficient. Controlled. He caught Serena's wrist and wrenched her hand down. Her body twisted, balance breaking as her heel caught on the edge of the rug. She reached for the dresser, her fingers clawing for purchase. Marcus's other hand came up. The sound that followed was not a scream. It was the hard crack of wood against bone, followed by the dull, final thud of a body losing its argument with gravity. The lamp toppled, light fractured across the walls, and then collapsed into shadow. Serena went down beside the dresser, her hair fanning across the floor. Marcus stood over her. He did not speak. He did not rush forward. He looked down, as if confirming a result that had already been calculated. In the doorway, a shape paused, only a shoulder, a sliver of someone watching, before withdrawing into the hall. Marcus knelt, one knee touching the floor, his fingers pressed against Serena's neck. He stayed there longer than necessary. Down the hall, a small voice called out, groggy and confused. "Dad?" Marcus did not answer. He rose slowly. As he did, the cuff of his coat dragged against the dresser edge, smearing dark. He bent, picked up the fallen watch, and closed his fist around it until the ticking stopped. 3 months later, Elena Hart stands in a courthouse side room in a dress she didn't choose and shoes that pinch. The air smells of old paper and floor polish. The officiant waits with a pen poised like a clerk at closing. Marcus Vail stands across from her in a black suit that fits like armor. No boutonniere, no relatives, no friends, just witnesses. A lawyer's assistant, a security man who never introduces himself, and a woman from Marcus's office who keeps her eyes on her phone. Elena holds a folder. The prenuptial agreement is inside. The clauses are neat and surgical, a life drafted like a contract. Marcus glances at it. Sign. Elena doesn't move. What's the hurry? This is a transaction, Marcus says, not a ceremony. The officiant clears his throat. We can't proceed. Marcus lifts a hand slightly, and the officiant stops, as if Marcus's authority extends into air and sound. Elena opens the folder, flips to the final page, and reads what she already knows. Publicly, stability for a child. Privately, a tightly controlled marriage that protects Marcus from further scrutiny and gives him a domestic shield he can place in front of cameras. She looks up. Your daughter needs a mother. Marcus's eyes narrow by a fraction. You will be her mother. The pen feels heavier than it should. Elena signs. Marcus signs immediately after, not hesitating, not reviewing, as if he memorized every word before he walked into the room. The vows are spoken like formalities. Marcus repeats them without looking at Elena. Elena repeats them with her eyes forward, voice steady. When the officiant announces them married, Marcus doesn't smile. He doesn't kiss her like a groom. He steps close, angles his body so any camera would catch it, and places a brief, controlled kiss at the corner of her mouth. Then, low enough that only she can hear, he says, You don't speak to reporters. I don't, Elena replies, face composed. You don't invite strangers into my house, he adds. Elena meets his eyes. And you don't ask questions about Serena. The name lands like a locked door. Understood, Elena says. Marcus turns away, as if the agreement is complete. That evening, Elena arrives at the mansion with one suitcase and a folder of personal documents. The house is lit perfectly. A 10-year-old girl stands in the foyer with a stuffed rabbit held tight against her chest. Dark hair, still eyes, a posture that looks taut. Elena sets her suitcase down slowly. Hi. The girl studies her without blinking. Are you Elena? Yes. The girl's gaze shifts behind Elena as if expecting someone else, then back again. Dad said you're staying. Elena nodded. If you'll have me. The girl's mouth tightened slightly, almost like she was deciding whether to approve a contract the way adults did. Mom hated strangers. Elena kept her voice level. I'm not here to be a stranger. Footsteps sound from a side hallway. Marcus appears, coat off, sleeves rolled, still unmoved by ceremony. Lila, he says. The girl's shoulders tighten. Dad. Marcus's gaze goes to Elena. Upstairs. Your room is prepared. Elena glances at Lila. Can I? Later. Marcus cuts in, calm and final. Elena follows him up the staircase. The carpets swallow sound. The hallway doors are all closed. At the end, Marcus opens a room that looks staged. Clothes hung, drawers lined, stationery on the desk, as if she might write letters like a woman in another century. Elena sets her suitcase down. Lila seems... Marcus's gaze turns sharp. Don't analyze my child. Elena nods once. Then how am I going to help her? Marcus steps closer without touching her. The space tightens anyway. You'll be consistent, he says. You'll be polite. You'll be here when she wakes and when she sleeps. Elena's eyes go to his hands. Clean, controlled, unmarked. A thought presses against the edge of her mind, like something behind a locked door. Marcus turns slightly. Dinner is at 7. He leaves without waiting for an answer. In the dining room, Lila sits with perfect posture. Marcus sits at the head of the table, eyes on a tablet, as if the house is a branch office. Elena sits quietly. Lila watches her. Do you cook? Elena glances at Marcus, then back at the child. Yes. Lila's voice is small, but firm. Mom didn't. She had people. Elena nods. Then maybe I'll cook sometime. Marcus's eyes lift briefly. No. Elena doesn't argue. She says calmly, I wasn't asking permission. The silence that follows has weight. Marcus sets his tablet down slowly. His gaze locks onto Elena. You'll learn that you don't correct me in front of my child. Elena meets his eyes. And you'll learn I don't disappear into a role you purchased. Marcus doesn't flinch. He looks at her like a man adjusting to an unexpected variable. Dinner ends without another word. Later, Elena tucks Lila into bed. The child clutches her rabbit. Do you have kids? Lila asks. No. Lila's gaze drifts to the doorway. Dad said you're my mother. Elena pauses. Yes, I am. Lila doesn't argue. Her eyelids lower. Elena leaves the door cracked and goes downstairs. She finds Marcus in his study. The door is ajar. On his desk, a folder lies open. Elena sees only the corner of a photograph and a thin gold band that catches the light. A watch. Marcus closes the folder with one smooth motion. Are you trying to see something? Elena keeps her voice calm. I didn't see anything. Marcus crosses the room and stops too close. You'll be watched, he says. By whom? Elena asks. By everyone, Marcus replies. Elena looks at him. Because they think you killed her. Marcus's gaze holds hers. They think what they're fed. Did you? Elena asks. Marcus doesn't answer. He doesn't deny it either. He reaches out, touches her jaw, turns her face slightly as if checking alignment. Possessive, controlled, not tender. You don't ask questions you can't afford, he murmurs. Elena's voice stays quiet. And what can't I afford? Marcus's eyes don't soften. The truth. He releases her and walks out. Elena remains there, staring at the closed folder, hearing the house breathe around her like a machine. Outside, Boston stays indifferent. Inside, Elena begins to understand the real danger. It isn't the story everyone believes. It's what the story is hiding. Morning enters the house without permission. Light slides through tall windows in clean lines, illuminating surfaces polished to the point of sterility. The mansion doesn't wake slowly. It transitions, like a system switching modes. Elena is already awake. She lies still for a moment, listening for patterns. The soft hum of the security panel, the faint shift of ventilation, the discipline of a home designed to notice first. Marcus has left before sunrise. She knows because the gates log an exit at 5:18, and the driveway cameras adjust their angle as they open. In the kitchen, Lila sits at the counter with her backpack aligned against the chair leg, her rabbit propped beside a bowl of cereal. She stares at a spoonful, as if time might change its taste. You're up early, Elena says. Lila looks up, nods once, then looks away again. Her gaze slips toward the hallway Marcus uses most often, as if the air there carries instruction. Elena pours coffee and sets a plate on the counter. Toast and fruit, nothing elaborate. She doesn't try to make the kitchen feel warm. Warmth can look like bribery in a house built on control. "What do you like for breakfast?" Elena asks. "Eggs," Lila says after thinking. "Not runny." Elena nods. "That can be arranged." As Elena cooks, she feels the child's watchful attention. Then Lila says, "You don't move like Mom." Elena doesn't turn. "How did your mom move?" Lila frowns, searching for words. "Like she was always late for something important." "Some people live that way," Elena says. "And Dad doesn't," Lila adds. "No," Elena agrees. "He doesn't." At precisely 7:12, a man appears in the doorway. "Mrs. Vale, I'm Voss. I'll be driving." Elena looks up. "I'll take Lila to school." Voss pauses. Not refusal, not agreement. Calculation. "I'll inform Mr. Vale." "That's fine," Elena replies. The drive is quiet in a way that feels intentional rather than peaceful. Elena watches the rearview mirror and sees a dark sedan join traffic behind them. It holds position through 2 turns, then 3. "Slow down," Elena tells the driver. He glances in the mirror. "Ma'am, slow down," she repeats. The car behind closes the gap. Another vehicle cuts across traffic and blocks them in. Elena's door opens. Marcus is there. He doesn't ask if she's all right. He doesn't look at the other car. His attention is entirely on her. "You don't stop in open space," he says. His hand closes around her elbow, firm without pain, final without violence. He guides her into his car and shuts the door. He speaks to the other driver without raising his voice. Elena doesn't hear the words, but she sees what matters. The other car pulls away. Marcus drives. He doesn't look at her. "You don't improvise with threats," he says. Elena watches the road ahead. "You just did." Silence answers her. That night, security doubles. Cameras shift their angles. The house changes the way it breathes. Elena understands that something has tightened, and it isn't only protection, it is containment. When Marcus returns, Elena sees his study door closed, then open, then closed again, and she understands something else. The house doesn't simply serve Marcus, it records him, and in a world built on documentation, that distinction is the first crack in a story that is held for too long. Elena's mistake doesn't come from fear, it comes from competence. She finds the anomaly late, buried beneath routine maintenance logs and system updates designed to blur distinction. A clean 2-minute camera gap, an external authorization signature, not Marcus. She does what she always does. She documents it. She timestamps the anomaly and cross-references it with access logs. She forwards a question to a contact with regulatory clearance, saved under an innocuous name. She doesn't attach evidence. She asks a careful question, framed like a professional inquiry. Then, she commits the one error that feels safe because it is ordinary. She uses the house network. By midnight, her contact replies. The message is short and precise. The override is real. The device signature matches third-party audit hardware, and the cut is too clean to be a glitch. Elena deletes the message after reading. She isn't paranoid. She is experienced. At 12:07 a.m., the small indicator light beside her laptop camera blinks once and goes dark again. In the morning, the system outpaces her. Her client meeting ends early, too early. The managing partner won't meet her eyes as he closes the folder. "Oversight boards don't like ambiguity," he says, "and your name has surfaced." Elena understands what he doesn't say. Her proximity has become an infection the firm wants to quarantine. She packs her office in a single box and leaves without argument. Losing a job is survivable. Losing leverage is not. At home, the house performs its quiet efficiencies as if nothing has changed. Chairs aligned, counters spotless, silence maintained at a level that doesn't suggest calm so much as vigilance. Marcus comes in and doesn't ask why she's home. He looks at her once, then at the security panel, then back. "You used the house network," he says. Elena doesn't deny it. Once, Marcus's jaw tightens. "That's enough." "It was a question," Elena says. "Questions create roots," Marcus replies. "Roots create maps." Elena holds his gaze. "Then I'll adjust." You already did damage, Marcus says. Elena doesn't flinch. So did you, years ago. For a moment, something shifts in his eyes. Not guilt, not fear, cost. Elena understands then that silence is not neutral. It's a condition maintained at expense, and she has increased the cost. She also understands something else. She is not investigating Marcus as a cop would. She is auditing the world around him, and someone does not want an audit. That evening, Lila sits at the table, drawing a house with too many windows. She doesn't look up when she asks, "Are people outside because of Mom?" Elena keeps her voice steady. People outside are there because of stories. Is Dad a story? Lila asks. Elena looks at the child's careful posture, at the rabbit clutched like armor, and answers honestly, without telling the whole truth. Your dad is a man people decided not to understand. Lila nods, as if she already knew. Upstairs, a door clicks shut. The study. The house logs it. Elena hears the soft mechanical confirmation and realizes the system is already reacting to her. She has made one tactical error. Now, she has to survive the correction. Elena cooks dinner on purpose. Not catered, not delivered, not arranged by staff who move like ghosts. She uses the kitchen as if it belongs to human life, not to systems. Garlic crushed under the blade of a knife, steam lifting gradually from rice. The small, ordinary sounds of a home that can't quite become one. Lila sits at the counter doing homework, with her rabbit propped beside her like a witness. She erases carefully, keeps the page clean, as if mess is another kind of danger. Marcus comes home late and stops in the doorway. He watches the scene as if it is a new variable introduced into a controlled environment. His gaze moves from his daughter to the stove to Elena's hands. It smells different, Lila says without looking up. Elena doesn't turn. I cooked. Marcus steps farther into the room and sets his phone face down on the counter. It's a small act, deliberate, and Elena notices it immediately. Through the kitchen window, beyond the clean line of lawn, a dark car sits at the curb with its lights off. It wasn't there 10 minutes ago. Elena keeps stirring. She doesn't look at the window. She doesn't change her posture. She lets the domestic stillness do what it's meant to do, conceal the fact that she has seen. Marcus's gaze shifts once, briefly, to the glass. He sees the car. He doesn't react outwardly. Instead, he reaches across the counter and adjusts Lila's collar with careful precision, a father's gesture performed without urgency. Then, he says evenly, Elena, bring the plates to the dining room. It sounds routine. It isn't. Elena lifts the plates and carries them not to the dining room, but into the side hallway where the security panel is embedded. She passes close enough for the panel camera to catch her profile. She doesn't touch the screen yet. She waits. Behind her, Marcus moves. The kitchen blinds lower by a few inches. Not enough to look like fear, just enough to break a direct line of sight. Elena returns to the kitchen as if complying. Dinner proceeds with controlled normalcy. Marcus eats neatly, attention divided between his daughter and the ambient hum of the house. Elena watches the subtle recalibration, the way lights adjust, the way the security system shifts thresholds, the way the house treats the car outside as information. Halfway through the meal, Lila's pencil stops. She looks up at Elena. Is Dad always watching? Marcus's eyes lift sharply. Elena answers without looking at him. Your dad notices things before they happen. Lila considers this. Does he notice me? The question sits in the room like a dropped object that nobody wants to pick up. Marcus says, finish your homework. Lila obeys, but her grip tightens around the rabbit. Elena sets her fork down. She looks at Marcus for the first time in 10 minutes. Who is outside? Marcus holds her gaze. People who want leverage. And what do they want from you? Elena asks. Marcus doesn't answer. Instead, he stands, crosses the room, and switches off the kitchen light. He leaves the small lamp on the counter, turning the room into softer shadows. Then, he opens the back door and steps out into the dark. Elena doesn't follow. She doesn't need to. The watcher has become the watched. She sees it through the window. Marcus, walking toward the curb with calm, unhurried certainty. The car's engine turns over. It doesn't speed away. It leaves with controlled timing, as if departure itself is negotiated. Marcus comes back inside and washes his hands. Elena watches him dry them, careful, methodical, as if removing evidence of contact. It is a domestic scene. It is also a warning. The house is quiet, and the quiet is full of teeth. Lorraine Ames isn't law enforcement. That is what makes her dangerous. She meets Elena in a glass conference room designed to erase personality. Two assistants sit behind her with laptops open. A pitcher of water sits untouched like a prop. "Mrs. Vale," Ames says, as if friendliness is policy. "Ms. Ames," Elena replies. "We're conducting a limited procedural review," Ames says. "Not an investigation, not an accusation." Elena nods. "Then your questions will be narrow." Ames's smile holds. "Let's hope your answers are." They speak of access protocols, compliance frameworks, oversight boundaries defined carefully enough to blur at the edges. Ames asks about timelines, internal permissions, security configurations. The questions are framed like administrative housekeeping, but the room is built for pressure. Elena answers precisely. She gives nothing extra. She lets the structure of the questions reveal more than the content. At one point, Ames says, "External authorization can be issued to third-party compliance vendors under specific circumstances." Elena keeps her gaze steady. "Issued by whom?" Ames leans back slightly. "By trustees, or by delegated officers acting under trustee authority." Elena waits. Ames studies her. "You're very calm for someone married into a scandal." "Calm is not agreement," Elena says. Ames's smile sharpens. "No, it's strategy." Elena inclines her head. "Then we understand each other." Ames slides a thin folder across the table. Elena doesn't open it yet. She waits until Ames speaks again. "We're trying to prevent reputational harm," Ames says. "For the child, for Mr. Vale, for the truth," Elena corrects. Ames's eyes hold, polite and empty. "Truth is complicated. Truth is documented," Elena replies. Ames's assistants pause their typing for a fraction, then continue. Near the end, Ames references a vendor designation casually. She uses the name like it's familiar and unremarkable. Elena repeats it once, as if confirming it for her notes. Ames nods automatically. The nod is small, insignificant on its own. In Elena's world, small things are how systems collapse. A nod becomes a confirmation. A confirmation becomes a timestamp. A timestamp becomes leverage. Elena closes her folder. "If there are no further questions." "For now," Ames says. As Elena stands, Ames adds, "Curiosity has a way of attracting attention." Elena meets her gaze. So does authority. The smile Ames gives her then is thinner, more cautious. Outside, Boston moves with indifference. Traffic flows. Pedestrians pass without looking at the building Elena just left. Elena walks to her car without rushing, but she feels marked because she understands what this woman represents. Not a villain in a dark coat. A system with teeth, wearing a professional smile. The house behaves incorrectly. It isn't something a guest would notice. Lights still rise in calibrated increments. Temperature still adjusts as designed. Cameras still rotate without sound. Everything performs its function with the quiet confidence of wealth. But Elena notices. She notices because the house trained her. She is halfway down the east corridor when the door at the end of the hall responds a fraction of a second too late to her proximity. It doesn't open. It doesn't alarm. It acknowledges her presence, hesitates, then returns to locked. The delay is slight, barely perceptible, but it is wrong. Elena stops. She doesn't touch the handle. She doesn't test it. She listens to the house reassert its rhythm as if smoothing over indecision. Downstairs, a door closes. Marcus's footsteps follow, measured and unhurried, moving through the dark with the certainty of a man who has lived inside surveillance long enough to treat it as normal. Elena remains on the landing, out of direct sight, watching the faint shift of light along the wall as Marcus crosses into the main hall. He stops at the security panel. The panel wakes at his touch. Marcus enters a code. The panel denies it politely, without alarm. as if asking for reauthentication is routine. Marcus enters the code again, faster, practiced enough to suggest habit rather than urgency. The denial repeats, and this time the panel chimes softly, a reassuring sound designed to feel harmless. Elena feels the shift before she names it. The system is documenting him. Marcus stands still. His fingers hover above the panel. He doesn't curse. He doesn't strike the wall. His posture remains controlled, but the alignment of his shoulders changes, as if his margin for error has narrowed. Elena descends one step. The sound is quiet. Marcus hears it and doesn't turn. He reaches into the inside pocket of his coat and removes a slim black access token. It rests in his palm longer than necessary, familiar enough to be routine, important enough to be dangerous. He brings it to the panel. The system pauses before accepting it. The hesitation is brief, but it is unmistakable. Elena watches the indicator blink, the interval between recognition and response stretching long enough to suggest the house has recorded, cross-checked, and flagged. The panel accepts the credential. The red indicator disappears. The house returns to baseline. Marcus lowers his hand slowly. For the first time since Elena has known him, he doesn't move immediately to the next step. He stands with his gaze fixed on the panel, as if measuring what it has already taken from him. Elena descends another step. Marcus turns his head slightly, just enough to confirm her presence. "You didn't see that," he says. The words are quiet, not a threat, not an order, almost procedural, spoken out of habit. "I saw it," Elena replies. "Forget it," Marcus says. "I can't forget what the system remembers," Elena answers. Marcus's jaw tightens. His hand closes around the token. For a moment, Elena thinks he might destroy it, remove the object the way he removes liabilities. Instead, he slides it back into his pocket. "You don't understand what just happened," Marcus says. "I understand the house noticed you before you noticed it," Elena replies. Marcus turns fully toward her. His control is still there, but it is thinner now, stretched across a calculation that shifted without his permission. "Everything here runs on tolerances," he says. "Nothing fails all at once. That's why delays matter," Elena replies. Marcus holds her gaze, then says, "Every correction leaves a trace." "Yes," Elena says, "and tonight, the trace belongs to you." Silence settles between them, heavier than the quiet the house maintains by design. It isn't the silence Marcus has relied on for years. It is the silence that follows a recorded error. Marcus looks past Elena, toward the corridor where the door hesitated. The house is flawless again, but the fault line exists now. "You'll stop pushing this," he says. Elena's voice stays calm. "I already tried." The system didn't. Marcus turns away and walks toward the study, his steps still measured, but no longer effortless. Elena remains on the landing, listening to the house absorb the interaction, knowing that somewhere in its logs, the story has changed, not publicly, but permanently. The final report arrives on a Wednesday morning and disappears into the news cycle with the discretion reserved for matters people want to be finished with. Marcus Vail is cleared of criminal wrongdoing. The cause of Serena's death is reclassified. A trustee is charged. The vendor dissolves. Oversight protocols are amended with language that suggests improvement without admitting failure. Boston moves on. The house doesn't. Elena reads the report once and closes the file. It corrects the public record without restoring what has been eroded by years of assumption. The truth rarely reclaims the space a lie occupied. It only rearranges the furniture. Marcus comes home earlier than usual that evening. He removes his jacket and places it on a chair by the wall. He stands, as if orienting himself in a space he no longer commands without effort. His movements are still precise, but he no longer corrects the room simply because correction is possible. "They're finished," he says. "For now," Elena replies. "They won't come back for me," Marcus says, as if testing the sentence. "No," Elena says. "They won't." Marcus studies her. "They'll come back for something else." Elena doesn't contradict him. The house responds to his presence with a subdued attentiveness. Lights adjust more slowly. The hum of the systems carries a note of hesitation, as if verifying permissions rather than assuming them. You can leave, Marcus says. Elena looks at him. Do you want me to? Marcus doesn't answer immediately. He goes to the sink and fills a glass with water he doesn't drink. When he finally speaks, the word doesn't come with the certainty it once would have. No, he says. The answer lingers between them, incomplete rather than resolved. Later, Elena finds him in the study. The door is open, the desk is immaculate, but now its emptiness reads less like power and more like restraint. The token is gone. What happened to the credential? Elena asks. It's decommissioned, Marcus says. Permanently? Elena presses. Nothing is permanent, he replies. Someone will issue another, under a different framework. And the house, Elena says. Marcus looks toward the hallway, as if he can see through walls. It will keep recording, even when we're not hiding, Elena says. He doesn't deny it. Upstairs, a floorboard creaks. Lila appears at the top of the stairs, with her rabbit held tight. She looks smaller than she should, not because she has changed, but because the world has. Are we safe? She asks. Marcus hesitates, brief and subtle, but Elena sees it. Elena answers before the pause can become its own wound. We're careful. Lila nods once, as if careful is the only honest promise adults ever make, then retreats. Marcus watches her go. You changed the angle, he says to Elena. Elena doesn't smile. Angles change back. Silence settles into the study, denser than before. This silence doesn't conceal anything. It acknowledges what remains unresolved. Outside, the city continues indifferent. Inside, the house logs less than it once did, but it logs enough. Elena stands at the doorway longer than necessary, listening to the building breathe around them. The quiet doesn't feel like safety. It feels like the absence of immediate consequence. Somewhere beyond the dissolved firm and amended protocols, another authorization will eventually be issued. It will be clean, justified, politely documented. No violence will be required to activate it. The house will record that too. Elena turns off the light and leaves the door open. The silence that follows doesn't soften with familiarity. It settles into place like a scar that healed incorrectly, strong enough to hold, fragile enough to reopen. And this time, nobody pretends not to hear it. The oversight board didn't meet in a courthouse. It met in a building that looked like an investment firm from the outside and like a hospital from the inside, clean enough to feel unfriendly. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and printer ink. People spoke in voices calibrated to avoid emotion. Elena arrived early and sat with her hands folded in her lap, posture composed. A compliance advisor was not meant to look rattled. If she did, the room would treat it as proof. Marcus arrived exactly on time. He walked in alone. No entourage, no visible counsel at his side. That choice drew attention. Powerful men normally traveled with witnesses. Marcus entered as if he didn't require them, or as if he preferred the accusation to remain uncomplicated. When he reached Elena, he didn't sit beside her. He took the chair behind, a half step back, placing himself in her line of sight without appearing to rely on her. It was a subtle arrangement, but Elena recognized its intention: to look unshaken, to look separate, to look like a man who had nothing to hide. Lorraine Ames stood near the glass wall with her assistants. She did not speak to Elena. She offered Marcus a polite nod, the kind given to a man whose name had carried weight before the scandal, and might again, if handled correctly. The hearing room itself was bright, white, and arranged so that every face could be seen. 5 board members sat behind a long desk, each with a tablet, each wearing an expression that could be described as neutral only by someone who had never been judged. A man at the center began. We're here to clarify inconsistencies surrounding Ms. Serena Vale's death and subsequent asset transfer, including third-party audit participation. Elena noted the phrasing. Clarify inconsistencies, not determine truth, not assign blame. It was a room designed to manage damage. Marcus sat with his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, still as stone. The first questions were procedural, predictable, and designed to sound fair. They asked about timelines, access permissions, whether Marcus had been present, whether he had cooperated. Marcus answered each question without hesitation and without elaboration. His voice remained even. He did not plead. He did not offer human language. He spoke like a man who had learned that warmth could be weaponized against him. "Did you ever instruct anyone to suppress a record of the night Ms. Vale died?" one board member asked. "No," Marcus said. "Did you ever authorize external audit access to your home security system?" another asked. "No," Marcus repeated. Elena didn't look at him. She watched the board. One of them leaned slightly forward. "Then how do you explain the external authorization signatures found in the logs?" A question, phrased carefully enough to appear neutral. Elena felt the room tilt toward Marcus, waiting for the moment he would stumble. Marcus didn't. He looked at the speaker and said, "I can't explain what I didn't authorize." A pause followed. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply the sound of a room adjusting when the expected crack didn't appear. Lorraine Ames stepped in smoothly, as if she'd been invited. "If I may," she said. The chair nodded. Ames's tone was calm, practiced. "External authorizations can be issued under trustee authority. It would not require Mr. Vale's direct consent if delegated frameworks were in place." Elena turned her eyes toward Ames then, not challenging, simply watching. Ames continued. "The question isn't whether Mr. Vale issued authorization, it's whether someone else did, under a structure legally permitted at the time." The board members exchanged brief glances. Elena could see the calculation. This explanation moved responsibility away from Marcus and toward a gray area that could be contained with paperwork. Elena waited. The chair asked, "And do we have record of such delegation?" Ames's assistant tapped rapidly, then slid a document forward. Elena recognized the vendor designation immediately. It was the same one Ames had spoken too comfortably in the conference room. Elena didn't speak yet. She didn't rush the moment. She let the board absorb the document, let the room accept the idea that the system, not the man, had acted. Then Elena leaned forward. "May I ask a question?" she said. The chair's eyes shifted to her with mild surprise. "Mrs. Vale, you're not counsel." "I'm not," Elena agreed. "I'm compliance." A quiet ripple moved through the room. People always underestimated what compliance meant until it mattered. Elena continued, her voice steady. "This delegation document references a vendor authorization window with a timestamp. Can you confirm the time zone used?" Ames's smile flickered for a fraction. Not fear, irritation. The assistant responded quickly. "Eastern." Elena nodded, as if satisfied. Then the authorization was issued after Ms. Vale's reported death, not before. Silence gathered. The board members looked down at their screens. Ames's posture remained composed, but her eyes sharpened. Elena kept her tone calm. If this delegation was legitimate, the timestamps should align with the event. They don't, which means either the document is misdated or the authorization was created retroactively. The chair's expression tightened. "Are you suggesting falsification?" "I'm suggesting a cover," Elena said, softly enough to remain professional. Marcus's gaze shifted to her then. Not gratitude, not warning, calculation. Ames stepped in, voice still polite. "There are reasons timestamps can drift." Elena nodded. "Yes, and those reasons have logs." The chair's hand lifted slightly. "We'll recess." As the room stood, Elena felt the atmosphere change, not toward victory, toward exposure. She had forced the system to acknowledge its own seam, and systems did not forgive that easily. Marcus rose and moved closer, stopping beside her without touching her. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. Elena didn't look at him. "You shouldn't have built a life that required it." He exhaled once, short and contained. "Now you put a target on yourself." Elena finally met his eyes. "It was already there. You just told me not to notice it." Marcus didn't answer. Lorraine Ames walked past them, still smiling. "Mrs. Vale," she said softly, "you're very intelligent." Elena held her gaze. "So are you." Ames's smile tightened. "Intelligence doesn't protect you from structures." Elena replied calmly. "Neither does silence." Ames walked on. Marcus watched her leave, and Elena understood something she hadn't allowed herself to consider until now. This was bigger than a marriage, bigger than one violent fall. It was a network that had learned how to kill without touching skin, and she had just made it look directly at her. After the hearing, the city's attention sharpened again, but it sharpened in the wrong direction. Headlines didn't read, "Systems falsified authorization." They read, "Marcus Vale faces renewed scrutiny." Photographs of Marcus leaving the building appeared within hours, his face composed, Elena's beside him, both of them framed like a couple caught between scandal and power. Elena understood the trick immediately. The public didn't want a procedural explanation. It wanted a villain. It wanted one man with one act, not a structure with 1,000 signatures. Marcus didn't correct them. He never did. At home, the house tightened again. Cameras shifted their angles. Doors latched with softer clicks that still sounded like decisions. The security panel glowed longer after each interaction, verifying credentials more carefully than before. Elena stood in the hallway that evening, listening to the house breathe around her, and felt the weight of her own choices. She had wanted truth. She had gotten attention. In a world of authorization, attention was a liability. Lila found her near the stairs. Rabbit clutched tight. "Are they coming back?" she asked. Elena crouched to meet her eyes. "People always come back when they think they can take something." Lila's voice was small. "Will they take Dad?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to lie to a child who had already learned what lies cost. "They'll try," she said. Lila's grip tightened on the rabbit. "Will they take you?" Elena's throat tightened slightly, but she kept her tone steady. "They'll try," she repeated. Lila nodded once and walked away, as if she had accepted that trying was the only promise the world ever made. Later, Elena went into the kitchen and found Marcus there, sleeves rolled, washing a glass that didn't need washing. The water ran too long. The sound filled the room like a mask. "Elena," Marcus said without turning, "you don't understand what you started." Elena leaned against the counter. "I understand exactly what I started." Marcus turned off the tap and faced her. His expression was controlled, but the control looked more expensive now. "They will not lose," he said. "They don't lose. They shift. They rename. They file new paperwork and keep moving." Elena nodded. "Then we keep tracing." Marcus's gaze sharpened. "No, we endure." Elena studied him. "That's what you've been doing, and it works," Marcus replied. "For you," Elena said quietly, "not for the people they erase." Marcus held her gaze without flinching. "You think you can fix a system by staring at it. I think systems break when they're exposed," Elena replied. Marcus stepped closer, not touching her, but tightening the space. "Exposure doesn't protect you," he said. "It makes you visible." Elena didn't step back. "Good." For a moment, Marcus looked as if he might say something that wasn't calculated. Instead, he turned away and walked toward the hallway where the security panel lived. Elena followed at a distance. Marcus stopped in front of the panel and stared at it as if it were a mirror he did not trust. The screen glowed faintly, waiting for instruction. "He didn't touch it, Elena," he said, voice low. "If I tell you something, you don't repeat it." Elena's posture stilled. "Tell me." Marcus's hand finally lifted and hovered near the screen without making contact. "Serena didn't die because she fell," he said. Elena didn't interrupt. Marcus's jaw tightened. "She died because she was going to expose the accounts." Elena's chest tightened slightly, but she kept her face calm. "The trustee." "Not only the trustee," Marcus said. "The trustee was the hand. The vendor was the pen, but the structure is older than both." Elena's mind moved quickly. "And you let them believe it was you?" Marcus's gaze remained on the panel. "It was safer." "For who?" Elena asked. Marcus finally looked at her. His eyes were steady, but the wear in them made the steadiness look less like power and more like endurance. "For Lila," he said. "For the house, for the inheritance, for everything Serena left that they would have taken if the story changed." Elena understood then why he never corrected the rumor. He had used himself as a shield, because the public preferred a monster to a mechanism. "And what about you?" Elena asked. Marcus's mouth tightened. I can live with being hated. I can't live with her being unprotected. Elena held his gaze. Then we're not done. Marcus's expression sharpened. You think there's an ending that feels clean. Elena's voice stayed steady. I think there's an ending that leaves evidence. Marcus's eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the rooms where the house held its quiet records. The house records everything, Marcus said. Elena nodded. Then we make it record the right thing. Marcus's gaze held hers for a long moment, and then he stepped aside, giving her access to the panel without invitation, without permission. Elena reached out and touched the screen. For a fraction of a second, the panel hesitated, as if deciding whether she was authorized to ask. Then, it accepted her. Elena didn't smile. She didn't relax. She understood what acceptance meant. It meant she was visible. It meant the system now knew her as a variable it would need to account for. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Elena turned her head slightly and saw Lila at the top of the stairs, watching them with her rabbit clutched tight. Marcus looked up too. They held the child's gaze in the quiet. No promises, no comfort, no speeches. And that's where our story ends. If you stayed until the end, I want to ask you something. If you were in her place, would you have lived with the silence, knowing it kept you safe? Or would you have named the truth, even after learning how quietly systems punish those who speak? Tell me in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who understands how power protects itself and how costly it can be to stand too close to the truth. Until next time, the house is still recording, the lights haven't gone out, and somewhere, another authorization is already waiting to be signed.